All right, here we go, everyone. Another awesome episode of the All Around Adventure podcast. And I'm very excited to welcome Kyle Mills to the show today, who is the current author of the Mitch Rapp series. So, Mr. Mills, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. It's an honor to have you here.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thanks.
Yes, lots to dive in today because I will say just right offhand here, sir, that I'm a big fan. The Mitch Rapp series is one of my all-time favorite series. And when Vince Flynn had passed, rest his soul, I wasn't sure what was going to come of the series, and I know it has a huge fan base, but I'm glad you decided to pick up the mantle and carry on with the series.
Yeah, me too. It's been a lot of fun, and I was a big fan of the series before I started writing it as well.
Yeah, so kind of going back to the beginning a little bit here in your writing journey, because every great story has a beginning, so that's where I'd like to start with you as well. So, and we're going to probably be going back and forth in your timeline a little bit here as we kind of hear more of your story. But I guess just to kind of kick things off, though, is just becoming a writer and carrying on this path of author and all the work that you've done. What kind of sparked it for you initially? What inspired you to become a writer in the first place?
Uh, you know, it's my story is maybe a little unusual in that I wouldn't necessarily say I was inspired to be a writer ever. Um, I worked for a bank. I was a commercial lender, and I was a really serious rock climber at the time. This would have been my late 20s. And I never did really anything creative. Those were kind of the two things I was focused on. And so I thought I'd always admired people that were creative. So I was trying to I was trying to think of a good, interesting creative outlet to add to the things I was doing. And my initial thought was to build furniture. But as my wife pointed out, I wasn't really very handy, and it would have demanded an enormous number of tools. Then we couldn't park in the garage, and it snows a lot where I live. So she kind of put the kibosh on that. And I really like to read, and she was the one that suggested, well, maybe you should just try writing a novel. And I don't know, it didn't seem like that great of an idea. I'd never studied writing, and I mean, I'd got C's in English, and but in the end, it sounded like kind of an interesting journey. And so I this was so long ago, I didn't even own a computer. I didn't have one in the house. So I bought a computer and got a word processor and uh, started writing a book. Didn't really think it would ever get published. Didn't really have any. I never was planning on writing a second one. But it turned out pretty good, and I thought, well, I'll try getting it published. And that's its own torturous journey, but it ended up getting published and went on to become a national bestseller, which was a huge surprise to me. So that kind of set me off on a journey of, now 22 books now.
Wow. So you continued on with a book that you didn't think that was going to get published at all, but then it became a bestseller. And would you say at that point, like you were just hooked, or and you just knew that that's what you wanted to do from that point forward? Or was there maybe still a little bit to go on after that, that actually sort of solidified that that's what you wanted to do for the rest of your life?
No, yeah, I definitely was not hooked. It's fun to write a book when there's no pressure and you're just doing it for
Sure.
yourself.
Yeah.
Um, so my agent had signed me to a two-book deal, which is what the publisher wanted. And I wasn't really prepared to argue, but like I said, I'd never planned on writing a second book. I didn't really have an idea for one. It's just not something I really ever thought about. So I embarked on the second book, and at that point, you have a lot of people pulling you in different directions, particularly if your first book was really successful, because they want to build on that. So suddenly, I went from kind of being a basement dweller with a computer to having agents and editors and fans and all this stuff pulling at me, and it's a weird situation because you have a thing called, like, I think they call it imposter syndrome, where you think some of these days, these people are going to find out I'm not really a writer. I'm just some guy who wrote a book, and all these people I thought were, these experts were, who've been in the industry forever, were calling me and shooting down my ideas and all this stuff. So I hated it. Um, I lost a lot of weight, and I was already really, really thin because I was a rock climber, and my hands shook all the time. And I decided, I asked my wife one day, I said, if I just quit, would would that bother you? And I just went back to banking, and she said, no, I think that'd be great because I think you're gonna have a heart attack, and you're only 29 years old. So I did. I sent a fax to my agent and said, I didn't spend any of the money they gave me. Can I just give it all back and quit? And he called me at like 8 the next morning and said, I've told everybody that nobody can call you, nobody can talk to you. All you have to do is write a book and deliver it. And so I said, okay, I think I can work under those parameters. And that became a New York Times bestseller. So I think that point, um, it seemed like something that was going to work potentially and that I would have a future in it. And I also felt more confident after I'd written two that I could write more. Writing one is very different than writing two. In fact, Tom Clancy told me when I was melting down that, wasn't very helpful. He was like, well, anybody can write one book, but two is hard. But if you can write two, you can write 100. And so I felt much better after I'd written that second one. I thought, oh, okay, I can write 100.
All right. Well, so something just stood out to me about what you just told us. And then you were talking about you sent a fax to your agent. So obviously, when you started writing, things were a little bit different. I mean, of course, like now with you doing the Mitch Rapp series, we have social media, we have online forums, we have all the stuff like that where people can just talk about your work. So, I guess maybe you have a lot more eyes on you this time around, versus when you just started. So I guess just what does it feel like now, just with a change like that alone, where it's just, as soon as you release a book, the feedback is almost immediate from like everybody. So I guess what has that transition been like as technology and, quote unquote, word of mouth has become a lot more prevalent?
I mean, it's got its good and its bad. Before you'd write a book and, the only way you could tell people liked it or didn't like it was sales. But sales, that relates a lot to marketing and there are a lot of things that relate to how many books you sell. And so that's kind of nice. I mean, you have interaction with fans. You didn't know who your fans were. You never talked to your fans unless you were on tour, or maybe they sent you a letter, like they wrote a letter.
Right.
And those usually came from prison for some reason. People write a lot, they read a lot in prison and send you letters. And so I think that's a real plus. The negative, obviously, is that not everybody likes you, and they can be pretty vocal about it. So,
right.
I think most authors who have long careers, and it would be the same for musicians or any kind of artist, they have pretty thick skins. We were just talking about this before the show that you're going to put stuff out there, and some people are going to like it and some people aren't. That's just the way it goes. Now, the one thing that the internet does, I don't know why must be human nature, is it amplifies the negative.
Right.
So, and there's not much you can do about that.
Right.
But, if you get 100, positive reviews and one negative one, the negative one's always going to be the top of the list and, with the most views and all that. But, what are you going to do?
Yeah, that's probably something just innate with us, but I think that's a whole long other conversation that's probably a podcast.
Get Steven Pinker or somebody on to do that one.
Yeah, that's a whole, definitely a deep, dark rabbit hole that we could dive into right there. But of course, like before you started writing, though, I mean, you kind of found yourself around the world quite a bit. I mean, first, like at a young age, I guess that you use the term bureau kid, like, which is similar to like an army brat or a military brat but it sounds like you probably didn't have to get up and move quite as often as someone in the military, because I would assume that, for someone who is stationed somewhere for the FBI will probably stay within that area for a longer duration than someone in the military would. So I guess just, when you were growing up as a bureau kid, like where did that take you, and where did you find yourself living?
I was pretty lucky. You know, we had started out in Utah, then moved to Oregon. We were in Oregon for a long time. That's where basically where I'm from. And then to DC, and then to London. And then I went off to college, and my parents ended up back in Virginia. So I was pretty lucky. You know, some people moved around quite a bit, but those were my main stops before I, you know, graduated, and I ended up moving to Baltimore and then to Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And so I did get around, and I've always appreciated that. It's I mean, it's a little weird. I think some people would find it strange. I was just talking about this with somebody recently that I didn't really have a home, that you know, a place. I think it's my ancestral home where my family lives, and you know, I would swim upstream to get to. That doesn't really exist for me.
Right. Yeah. So kind of being over in London, and of course, that was another part of your story that kind of intrigued me because, you know, again, before we hit record here, I was kind of telling you that I've been an expatriate myself. I lived in Yorkshire, but, you know, definitely made my way down to London on a few occasions. And I would say to this day, it's one of my favorite cities that I've ever been to, mostly just because the history, of course, and I've mentioned I'm an archaeologist, so that aspect of it too definitely intrigues me. And the food choices, I'm a big foodie. I'm not gonna lie. So after you moved away from London, did you ever find yourself back there, or do you feel like, you know, just that would be, I don't know, too cliche to go back and retrace your steps? Have you found your way back to the UK at all?
Yeah, definitely I have. I really love that city. It's changed a lot since I lived there. I mean, you mentioned being a foodie. When I lived there in the 80s, you know, they basically had British food, which you didn't want to get mixed up with, and
Right.
Indian food, which is amazing. So you basically ate Indian food all the time. That's about all we ate. Now it's a much more, it's so cosmopolitan, and I mean, it's a little bit of everything. So no, I've spent a fair amount of time there. In fact, I'm probably going to go back for a month next winter. Um, yeah, because I mean, they just expanded the British Museum, which I'm dying to see the expansion of that.
Mm.
And it's just such an interesting, like massive, interesting place with all the, you know, the history and stuff. So yeah, I mean, it's so different now. I almost don't see it as being going back to the place that I once lived, because I just can't even remember. My dad and I used to go jogging in the park, and people thought like we'd robbed a bank. They'd never seen anybody running before.
Right. Well, now you got me intrigued with you about the British Museum because well, for one, that museum is already huge in and of itself. I mean, it's like you've almost got to commit a day of travel just for that alone. Now they're expanding it. I mean, they
I
must be
think
turning.
it's been done. I'm not 100% sure of this if it's completely done because of COVID and everything, but I think they were like doubling the size. So
Hmm.
yeah, it's like be like a week to go through that.
All right. Well, it sounds like I might have to get myself back to the UK as well. All right. So, and also along the way is just, you know, when you kind of came back stateside from there, you know, you still kind of found yourself on the move quite a bit, you know, as a rock climber. And was it also around the time of you getting into rock climbing that you like started writing, like writing about rock climbing, if I'm not mistaken? Does it fall in the timeline there some way?
Well, I started climbing, and then I moved to Wyoming because, you know, the climbing's really good here. Um, and that's when I got into writing maybe a year later after I moved to Wyoming. Um, I did write a book about a climber once. I had that idea for a long time, but it's funny that no one was interested in it. I thought it was interesting because I've always found the fact that there are a lot of subgroups in the world that you don't know anything about to be super fascinating. And rock climbers are one of them. I mean, they're really interesting group of people that kind of live much less so now. I mean, they're more known now, but it was very much under the radar. And I thought people would find it really interesting just to learn about these people and be a good setting. No, I didn't want to write a book about rock climbing. It was just that there was a climber who was a character in it. And then Krakauer wrote Into Thin Air, and it blew up. And then all of a sudden, everybody wanted me to write this book about a climber. So I finally got to do it, but it was all because of John Krakauer.
So, do you think rock climbing may play a role in maybe future Mitch Rapp novels in some way, somehow? Maybe a mountainous setting somewhere.
In a very minor way. Like, in fact, the book I'm writing now, he has to rappel down something, but I mean, it's not it's not about climbing. But I do use those now very rusty skills to when people have to go in the mountain. Like I had him backcountry skiing once in Russia, and I do a lot of backcountry skiing, so that kind of stuff's
okay. Well, I feel like maybe you included some elements of climbing in some of your recent books, especially when I think of Enemy at the Gates, when you were describing Nicholas Ward's compound, and I'm like, okay, this guy's compound's on top of a mountain and that's done deliberately because someone would have to climb up that to get to it. So maybe that was woven in there somehow, maybe just subconsciously, with your rock climbing experience.
Yeah, I mean, all those things, you write what you know. And like Vince, I mean, it would help me. Vince made Mitch Rapp a triathlete, and I'm a big mountain biker. So, Mitch, there are scenes now that Mitch is a cyclist, and, because I know about what it's like to race bikes and things like that. So that's kind of fun to throw in there and, throw a few like little details in that only bikers would know.
Right.
It's one of the things that makes books interesting, I think.
Yeah. So I guess kind of now that we're kind of sort of on that subject, is just how did you actually end up finding yourself continuing on with the series? Because I guess I'm not sure exactly how the process would work as far as talking with agents and publishers and things like that. I mean, did you and a few other thriller writers, I don't know, battle royale for the honor of carrying on the mantle? I mean, I guess, I mean, how would that work? How'd you find yourself picking up the series?
It was not that at all. They called me. So, I knew that Vince had died, and as a fan, I was a fan of that book, but I really wanted to see the series end. Even if Mitch Rapp died, that would be a fitting end to the series, or whatever happened, but not to just kind of have the book, the series just fade away. And so, yeah, I mean, a few weeks later, I think it was, I got a call asking if I might be interested in doing it. And yeah, I wasn't sure. Honestly, Vince had a lot of fans, a lot of really rabid fans. I didn't know if people would want the series continued by another author. So, I told him I'd think about it and, maybe shoot him some ideas. I reread The Last Man, see if I knew where I'd go with it. He hadn't left it in a very easy place to continue from. And yeah, so I decided, I thought maybe I could do a credible job, and kind of sent them some thoughts about where I'd go with it. But I was like, yeah, I'm not going to commit to this though, because it'll probably change while I'm working on it. Who knows what you'll get, which, probably wasn't a great way to interview. But a few days later, they said, great, go ahead and do it. So, yeah, I embarked on writing The Survivor, and it took forever. I went back and read all the books again before I started it, and really tried to stay faithful to what Vince had created and his voice.
Well, and of course, you brought up the point about how you're wondering if you may want to end this series at some point with Mitch Rapp ultimately dying. But then, of course, you kind of, I don't want to say went in an entirely direction where that wouldn't be a possibility. But one thing that you've talked about and that I've also observed is that, you're not aging Mitch Rapp in the books anymore. Whereas Vince, would make it a point every now and then to talk about how Mitch Rapp is aging, actually specifically saying his age in each book, and the same thing with the other characters as well, too. But of course, I would imagine that's got to be difficult to do so, especially when it comes to other character dynamics. Of course, he's got young Anna and Claudia at his place. And then, of course, he's going through different presidential terms now and, making relationships with other presidents for better or for worse. And, I'll encourage people to read the books to find out what I'm referring to. So I guess just based on that, and then you just even mentioned that you're working on another one. So it's just, do you find yourself just really taking the series like what Ian Fleming did with James Bond and just letting it go as long as possible? Mitch Rapp's going to be in his mid 40s, like up until like 2050 or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, basically, yeah, you're right. Yeah, so Vince aged him realistically, but I didn't really feel that I had the ability to do that. I mean, I don't want to speak for Vince, but I mean, in reading the books, my assumption was that, he would eventually, Mitch Rapp would get too old to do that stuff, probably right when Vince wanted to retire. And that would be the end of it. Or maybe Mitch would go into more of a supervisory role and some new guy would, or guy or gal would rise up. So because it's not my series, I didn't feel like I could do that. And, the fans have, an insatiable sort of desire to see Mitch Rapp running around kicking butt. And there's only so long you can do that. It's funny, Mitch and I are exactly the same age. And so it's easy for me to gauge what it would have been like for him to be, 56. And particularly being an outdoor athlete, still kicking around a little bit, I can tell you it's not as easy as it was 10 years ago. So it's better for him to kind of stay vaguely in his mid 40s, though it does cause problems. I mean, the main problem I really hadn't thought of is when I created Anna. Mm-hmm. Actually, Vince created Anna, but I brought her back into the story. It's weird for her not to age because, a 44-year-old, yeah, they get older than not. That doesn't really change anything. A 7-year-old becomes 8 or 9 or 10, the difference in them is really, really great. So the fact that she's sort of stagnated around 7, I think is a little bit of a problem. But if I start aging her, eventually she'd be older than Mitch.
Right.
So I haven't quite figured out what to do about that.
All right. Now, just getting into the series as well, as you've mentioned, is just, Vince Flynn had built up a huge fan base for the character, lots of loyal fans, and myself included. So I guess just your overall thoughts and feelings going into this, because I think it goes without saying that you had some big shoes to fill continuing on with the series. So I guess were you really nervous at all, or were you really excited to take on the series? I guess just what was going through your head once you kind of signed the initial contract to continue on with it.
Yeah, I was really nervous. We talked about the internet amplifying negativity. And when it was announced I was going to take over, I had steeled myself for just kind of an outpouring of hatred. And it never materialized. I mean, I probably could count on one hand the negative emails I got. Almost everybody loved Vince. They loved the character. They wanted to see Mitch continue on. They wanted to see Vince's legacy continue on. And then it was just a matter of not screwing it up. I mean, they definitely did make that point in a polite way. They wanted to see the books continue on, but still be good. So, there was a lot of pressure for that because people might have also been, and a lot of people have, I think, gone into them with kind of a negative feeling. And if you start a book with a negative feeling, it's hard to like it. And I still get emails from people that said, until just last week, I have resisted reading any of these books. I was a huge fan. I mean, I'm writing book number 9 now. And they're like, I refused to read one of these books. And finally, I just broke down and read The Survivor, and I loved it. And so I think because I've really tried to, I don't write Kyle Mills books with Mitch Rapp in them. my goal is to write Vince Flynn books. I don't write anything. Honestly, if you read my books, I don't write anything like Vince. So that's always the goal. So hopefully people have appreciated the fact that I constantly think about where would Vince be going with this series. I mean, the world's changed enormously since he died. It's strange to say because he hasn't been dead that long, but
Right.
this is not the world that Vince Flynn experienced. And so I'm constantly having to extrapolate, what would he be writing about now? I mean, what would it be interesting in him? What would his attitudes be based on what I know about him personally and what I know about his books? So I've tried to do that faithfully, and I think people appreciate how much effort I put into that.
Right. Yeah. And then, of course, yes, some of the, I wouldn't say like changes that you made like necessarily, but obviously you introduced some new elements like into the books as you went, especially in the realm of like characters and things like that. I mean, honestly, I'd say Grisha Azeroff is probably one of my favorite characters like in the entire series. Of course, now it's just when you talked about him in your latest book, just being in California, gaining 20 pounds and just kind of, leaving it all behind. I hope I will say this. I hope he finds his way back into the Mitch Rapp story somehow, because I really liked him, especially in was it Enemy of the State? I really liked him in that book when they were all in Africa. But then also it's just you kind of got into some there were some ideas that you brought forth as well that I thought were interesting that actually were almost too real that they were scary. And my favorite one personally, sir, is this one right here. And for anyone who's not watching on YouTube, I'm holding up the book Total Power, this is your sixth book. And this to me was actually, I'd say it was terrifying because it felt more like a post-apocalyptic thriller than it did a political action adventure thriller. And your author's note, you talked about how the state of America's power grid is basically in such bad shape that this book practically wrote itself. So I'm like, okay, this book is scary. So going along with that, I guess is just continuing on from like one book from another is just like, where do you kind of go to grasp ideas to carry it forward? I mean, you did talk about the changing world, new technologies, current events, and so on and so forth. But I guess, can you just maybe cue us in a little bit on your process when it comes to gathering ideas to influence your writing?
Yeah, I think the most important thing for me is to get my news, say, because obviously I write about politics and geopolitics, from a lot of different perspectives, because that's where the ideas I think come from. You see, because one incident maybe has a lot of different perspectives, and so I watch or read or whatever. I mean, everything from MSNBC to Fox to Al Jazeera. I used to watch a lot of RT. It's like Russian kind of propaganda.
Right.
But they took it off. You can't get it anymore since the war. But the great thing about RT is it, like, the stuff they say isn't accurate, but it gives you the perspective of the Russian people. And so or many of the Russian people, or what, at least the information that the Russian people are getting. So that I think is fascinating to me, because to some extent what you believe is reality. And so those are the things, or even stuff that just doesn't get played much on, just doesn't get much traction in the United States because it's maybe not something Americans would be interested in. I watch a lot of like Euro news, and they have very different perspective. You spent time in Africa, and you probably found the same thing I did when I was living there, and that is, in a way, the United States barely even exists. Like, you can watch whole news programs and they never even mention us.
Right.
Because they got their own fish to fry, right? So that's how I kind of distill or find these interesting challenges to the world, or these interesting perspectives where maybe somebody's covered an idea, but they haven't covered it from this angle, which I think people would be interested in. And so that's always been my process, is look at both sides of the story and also to play them out, I think, kind of faithfully, because I like villains that are well-rounded, and a well-rounded villain, somebody once told me, every every villain is the hero of his own book, right? I mean, they
Hmm.
feel justified in doing these things and they have a reason for doing it. And I like to portray that to make people think about, you know, well, if I was in that position, would I be kind of thinking the same thing? So that's kind of um, what bounces around in my head when I'm trying to think of a new theme for a book or something, an interesting uh, thing to look at. Like the total power. Is the power? The whole that started with a question. Is the power grid vulnerable? If so, how would you attack it? And if you did attack it, what would the effect be on the United States? And try to play that out realistically.
Right. And then, it's talking about perspective. I mean, obviously the main antagonist in Total Power as well, obviously much of what sort of was his, motivation for, attacking America's power grid was just out of frustration, always talking about the vulnerability of the power grid to like the government and constantly being ridiculed and turned down for it too. And so it's just, divine justice in his eyes, more or less, wielding that power. And then even kind of going back to the beginning of the series, like I think of like transfer of power. And, obviously Vince had many chapters showing Rafiq Aziz's point of view too. And, his thoughts getting in his head, and just him talking about why he was attacking the White House the way he was. So yeah, I appreciate that thoroughness of you, really trying to look at it from multiple angles and, integrate it in your story. And I will say it shows, especially now that we're talking about it.
Oh, well, good. I love hearing from people that say, "Oh, you made me look into this," or "I'd never thought about it from that angle," or whatever. It's kind of fun. I mean, I always enjoy it when I learn something new, or somebody tells me something that I guess most people don't like this, but I'm always interested in people telling me something that I think I knew and finding out I was wrong. I always find that kind of fascinating and a little scary about how many things I think are true um, that aren't.
Right.
Listen, I can't remember what Mark Twain said something about that. It's it's not the things you don't know that get you. It's the things you absolutely are sure are true and just aren't so, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. So now here's kind of a little bit of an offshoot question for you. So obviously, the premise of the book, Total Power, without any spoilers, if anyone hasn't grasped what we've been talking about so far, is that this domestic terrorist, with the help of a few ISIS operatives, successfully plunge all of America into the dark. So, it's like that for months. And that's why I say this felt more like a post-apocalyptic thriller because of how long the power grid was down for. And then you brought this up in the book, and I would say that these figures are actually pretty accurate. If this were to happen in real life, that within about a year, 90% of the population would be dead in a total blackout scenario like this. And which, I guess in this day and age, we've become very reliant on technology. And I mentioned at the start of this conversation, or before we hit record, rather, that I'm an archaeologist by day. And, I've studied a little bit on prehistory, and we've existed for millions of years on this planet without things like electricity and running water. So humans are capable of living on this planet without such modern amenities. But I think, we're so far removed from that now that should we lose electricity tomorrow, then we'd have a harder time dealing with it than I think we'd, like to think. And then you see like other books where there's these crazy attack situations like this. I think of like Jack Carr's James Reese series, especially in the book The Devil's Hand, with a biological attack. And so this is a roundabout way for me to ask you this question: is like, has anyone ever like given you any feedback that you may be giving some bad people out in the world like bad ideas about maybe how to attack like America in sort of like these ways? Has that ever come up like at all?
It's something you think about. I mean, the somebody just did attack the U.S. power grid in the way that something like the way I described. Um, yeah, I don't know. I really think that bad actors, get their ideas from novels. I don't think so. The Anybody that would could go to the lengths I write about. I tend to write about really grand plots of, like whatever it would be, might be bioweapons or, bringing down the grid or something like that. Vince did the same, smuggling in a nuclear weapon or something like that. I think they would probably have their own thoughts about how to do that without our help. Certainly, like Tom Clancy wrote very realistic books about how things could be done. So until it really were to happen, I don't worry about it now.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. So now kind of getting back into the realm of us talking about traveling and like living abroad. I know that you kind of sort of live both like in Spain as well as at your home in Wyoming. So I guess just like how much time do you spend at like each one? And I guess like how do you kind of sort of set up your environment in each location so that way you could write accordingly without like, let's say, distractions and so on and so forth?
About half and half. So 1 year here, 1 year there. To answer the first part of that question, I would not say I'm easily distracted or that I need any kind of specific environment to work in. I mean, some people are really crazy about that. I've got to face north and, sun and windows and all that stuff. It doesn't really bother me. I mean, the last time we spent a year in Spain, we just got back a few months ago. We really had a hard time finding housing and just rented this tiny little house that had, I mean, it was not luxurious. Like when you took a shower, one of us would have to, the hot water ran on a propane tank out back and you'd have to go shake it. So like when I took the shower, my wife would shake the tank, and when I took a shower, or she took a shower, I'd be out there shaking it. Like a hot plate, like dual hot plate thing for it's pretty basic. And I just sat on the bed because there wasn't much furniture, so I just sat on the bed. I'd get up, go have breakfast, and go back to bed with my laptop on my lap, which is great. I mean, that to me, being able to travel, being able to live anywhere, is one of the great benefits of being a writer. I mean, I finished The Survivor in London. We were in London for a couple of months. I finished that one there. I've, written books in Africa, Asia, I mean, just about everywhere, Australia. So, that's honestly, if somebody said, what's the best thing about being a writer? It'd probably be nobody really knows where you are and nobody cares.
Right. Location independence. I like it. Yeah, because I feel like with many writers, and maybe other people might think this way too, when they think of like someone who just makes a living on writing novels, is that they probably just have like these immaculate offices with like all the walls are just lined up with bookshelves and like artifacts like that they collected from here or from there. But it's just, but I guess it can very well just be done anywhere, especially in this day and age too, with internet connections and, now computers can fit in our backpacks, rather than just like taking up an entire desk somewhere too. Or if you even want to go further back with either typewriters or writing by hand just as well too. So,
yeah, I mean that, like I said, some people like to have a really nice environment. I certainly understand it. I've just honestly never been lucky enough to have a house that had a beautiful, space for that. I always think it's I was talking to Brad Thor on Zoom recently, and he's got this really cool office, and I kind of covered it.
Yeah. So, now one thing I do kind of want to ask you here, since we're kind of talking about, your process and your environment. Let's say if we have someone listening right now, and this would include me, who may be an aspiring writer, or maybe wants to take a stab at writing a book. Like they got an idea and they want to bring it to life somehow, and they may want to do it through the realm of writing a novel. Just what would you say would be some of your big tidbits, your biggest pieces of advice that you would probably give? Because again, that's probably another like podcast episode in and of itself. But I guess like what would you have? What would be like, let's say your top three? Well, just to narrow it down.
I would say number one, finish it. So a lot of people bog down and they'll write a chapter and then they want to make that chapter perfect, and then they'll spend 10 years writing a chapter. Definitely not. I mean, there are people certainly that do it that way, but It's not a great way to do it for most people. Um, the second is you gotta remember it's work. If you're writing a book for yourself, that's fine. But if you're writing a book that you want to get published, that you want to, try to make a living, you've got to be really so critical of yourself. You can't fall in love with stuff you've written. A lot of it gets thrown out. Um, and you really got to look at every word and think, why is this good? Why is this here? Am I screwing this up? I mean, I think about it, but if I write a book, my first draft is maybe 115,000 words, roughly, generally speaking. In the end, I'll throw out 15,000 of those, and it'll end up being about 100,000 words. And I worked really hard on those, but I had to look at them and think, these don't go anywhere, or it's really wordy or whatever. But I mean, that's the equivalent of, I don't even know, 10 chapters or something. So, I think editing and looking at it from a reader's perspective are all very important if you want to be a commercial writer and be a commercial success. If you want to, write a book for yourself or for a much smaller audience, then, that might be different.
Okay. All right. So now what's next for you? I mean, you did say you are working on the ninth book. Are you able to share anything at all, or is this kind of sort of shrouded in secrecy at the moment?
No, it's shrouded in secrecy. It's a continuation of the universe. You always kind of know a little bit about what's going to happen with Mitch because of where the last book ended up. I see this series more as one long book than, whatever it is. I think I'm writing the 22nd. So, yeah, just a kind of a continuation of the series in the same style of the series, and taking into account, where Mitch is now, with feeling a little older, having a family, just had a lot of problems with the government, with the president, and little, kind of where he's going to go forth. I mean, the world has changed. You think of Mitch as having always been kind of a fighter of Middle Eastern terrorism and, fighting in Afghanistan and all these things, and those things being, less prevalent than they were when he started his career. So what's his place in the world? These are all the kind of themes that I think are going to be handled going forward in the next few books.
All right, then. Well, so right now, though, your latest book is this one right here, Oath of Loyalty, and this came out just this year, and so that is available. And I guess I would assume everyone can just find books just about anywhere books are sold, Amazon, bookshops, and things like that. Correct?
Yeah, you should be able to find that one pretty easily.
All righty, and of course, I'll link everything up in the show notes too, just to make it nice and convenient for our listeners to find. All right, Kyle. Well, another thing I kind of like to ask my guests is just, to say that you've covered a lot of ground throughout your life, I mean, is definitely an understatement. I mean, traveling and living many places as a bureau kid, traveling to places as a rock climber, and then, of course, being an expatriate, being location independent as a writer. So just along the way, what would you say have been some of your big takeaways? What have been some of your big life lessons that you've kind of learned from traveling and writing along the way? And I know that's a loaded question because there could be a lot of them, but I guess what kind of comes to mind?
I think probably one of the interesting life lessons I've come away with is that people, to some extent, have lost their empathy. And by empathy, I mean that in a literal sense, not sympathy, but their ability to put themselves in other people's shoes. And
yeah,
I think travel has really made look at the world in a very different way. Look at the United States in a different way. It's it's weird to come back here after a year, like being gone for a year. Not only does the United States change, which is weird, because you don't think of that happening in a year, but you notice it going on slowly. But how different the attitudes, and I mean, primarily I do the Spanish, the attitudes of the Spanish and the Americans are about, maybe the same subject matter. And so, or or even the information that they have and that they process uh, on the same subjects. So that's probably one of the most interesting things. Certainly, Africa was very much that way, where it's very, very different than the United States. Um, and it was a little hard to process like what was going on there because it was so different than what I had become accustomed to. And after a while, you start understanding people's motivation if you try. But like a lot of people don't want to try; they just want to sort of bring their own culture and their own ideas to new places. And I think that's one of the things I've liked about getting around the world, having father as a diplomat and stuff, is that you really do get to immerse yourself. You get to make friends. It's not like you're going for a week. You can go and you make friends, um, and learn how people feel about things. So I think that's probably my big takeaway from what I've been lucky enough to do to be able to get around the world a lot.
Yeah, when I was living in West Africa as a Peace Corps volunteer, we kind of had a joke in the Peace Corps. We say that it's not a 2-year commitment; it's actually a 4-year commitment. 1 year to apply, because it literally did take me that long just to apply for Peace Corps, and then 2 years of serving in country, and then 1 year to get adjusted to life back in the States after you've been away for that long. Because I had like kind of like similar issues. I guess I mean, people use the term reverse culture shock. And I mean, I guess maybe that's like what it was, but it was just, and I think, well, for me, considering the location I was in, where I'm looking at like extreme poverty, I didn't have electricity or running water in my hut in my village that I was living in. So just first world problems, I guess, was what I observed more than anything. So, I mean, so I guess, would you say that that's been a big issue with you as well? Like, has, I guess, quote unquote, reverse culture shock been an issue at all coming home to the States?
A little bit. I think the funniest one was coming back from Africa. We hadn't been there for that long. I mean, we had lived there for 4 months or something. And going into a grocery store and just feeling unbelievably overwhelmed in the
Yeah.
United States. Because, the grocery stores were all small and they had whatever was in season. I remember
Mm-hmm.
just eating like God, basil, man. Just everything had basil in it. And then one day you walked in and they're like, "Oh, the basil's gone." We're like, "Where's all the basil?" No, we have pumpkin, like squash. All right, we're doing squash. And I learned to really like it. That you could go in with your basket. Those were your choices, so you chose them. And then I came in back to the United States, and like I think I just turned around and walked out. I'm like, I don't know what I want. And I think was an interesting, like very trivial. Certainly coming back from Spain, the amount of, in the United States now, you're gone from it for long periods of time. The amount of kind of rage here is a little overwhelming when you come back. Um, Particularly when you're coming back from Spain, which is a much poorer country than the United States. It's hard to wrap your mind around a little bit what everybody's so angry about.
Yeah.
They and I think it's another thing, maybe a life lesson from traveling is, and I've said this many times in interviews where people are complaining or something, and I want to say, I like the let me just make one fundamental point, and that is America's awesome, like unbelievably, ridiculously awesome. You have
Oh, yeah.
no idea what you have for having been born here, like what you have access to. And I mean, I love Spain. Obviously, I lived there, but it's a very different vibe. Like I said, I'm living in a place with a hot plate. We didn't have heat in the downstairs. I mean, and this was, I mean, all my Spanish friends just consider that really normal. I mean, to the point where we've just bought a place there and they're having it gutted. We're like, Americanize it. We want air conditioning and heat and beds we both fit in. I mean, like a sink, hot water in it. And I know everybody's going to think, you Americans, you're so excessive. Um, so I think that one for me is, and I know my wife was kind of like really reticent almost to come back. She's like, it's so nice to be away from kind of the political fighting that the anger that you can't quite figure out. Nobody seems to know what exactly they're mad about. They're pretty darn mad. um, and I will say it's nice to get away from that. It didn't used to exist.
Yeah, and I certainly do agree with you, and I definitely have been very deliberate as of late, especially like on social media, making sure I'm just like kind of unfollowing a lot of like these negative people and negative accounts that just want to keep just perpetuating this over and over and over again. But one thing that's kind of sort of helped me is this was something I hadn't shared with you yet. Is just that like last year I actually completed a through hike across the entire state of Michigan, which is my home state. Took me about 3.5 months. But one thing that was really nice, I did still have to be on social media because I was doing it for charity. So I had to obviously like post updates and try to get people to donate to my cause and everything like that. But it's just being on the ground, walking that far, because I had to walk 1,200 miles to make it from one side of the state to the next. It's just fortunately in the real world, as I'll say, offline, I didn't observe very much of, the division and the discontent for each other. And because I met so many different people along the way, like people who had different viewpoints that I had. And of course, this was last year. People still had different thoughts and feelings about COVID measures and so on and so forth. But, at the end of the day, we were just good people. And I always say that people, we just want the same thing. I mean, we all want some money in the bank. We all want to have some romance in our lives. We want, good, safe environments for our families and our kids and so on and so forth. Maybe how we go about achieving those things may be one different. We may take different paths to achieve those. But at the end of the day, we all just really want the same thing. So I always like to say, can we focus on ways that we are similar versus ways that we are different? But again, that's another deep, dark rabbit hole that I'm sure, we could really dive into. But
Well, thank God for all these divisions, or thriller writers wouldn't have anything to write about.
Yeah, so we'll go with that for sure. Lots to pull from, indeed. All right, sir. Well, as we kind of get into the wrap of our conversation, another thing I like to ask my guests to do is issue a challenge to our listeners, because stories, information, and things along those lines can only take our listeners so far. If we really want to achieve things in our lives, we have to utilize action in order to obtain them. So with that, what challenge would you issue to our listeners today for them to go out there and start living a more adventurous life?
The thing I learned when I moved to Jackson Hole was that you really have to think about why can't I do something as opposed to why can I do something. And I had, to me, when I moved here, there were people that did just these amazing things, and things I never considered. In fact, an anecdote would be, I had a friend, I met a guy climbing. He's a professional climber, and we didn't know each other very long, a few weeks. And he called me. I just moved here, and he said, "Hey, I'm going to go to Thailand and climb for a few months. You should come with me." And I said, "Well, I can't leave for 2 months." And he said, "Sure you can. I own a house there. It's going to be free. Just fly over." I said, "Well, I have a job." And he said, "Well, quit." I'm like, "Well, I can't just quit my job." And he's like, "Yeah, you can." And I didn't in the end, but I thought, yeah, I could have. I could have found another job. I could have gone to Thailand for a few months and just been the professional climber bum and come back and found another job. I mean, I was only probably 25 years old. It wouldn't have ended my life. And so I like to think about that always now, because sometimes you hear people have crazy ideas, or you want to do something that you start thinking through all the reasons you can't do it. And now I try to think of all the reasons I can.
Okay. All right. Right on, sir. And next, what I have for you is my final three. These are three fun questions. At least I like to think that they're fun questions that I ask all my guests at the end of the show. So you're going to get asked these as well. And the first of those three questions is, what is your favorite place that you've been to so far?
Oh, man, that's such a broad question because there are so many categories.
Right.
Maybe Cape Town, South Africa. That is an incredibly beautiful, incredibly weird and interesting place.
Well, that has been a major setting for your last few books. So I guess, yeah.
Yeah, I have such a memory of it's easy to write what you know, and so when I need it to
Right.
set them somewhere else, I don't have to look it up all the time. So yeah,
Right.
and I need to get back there. I haven't been in years.
All right. And next question. What is one thing on your bucket list that you have yet to do?
Oh, geez, so many, really. I'd like to go heli skiing in Kazakhstan. I
Wait,
gotta.
so heli skiing, what does that entail? I'm not a skier, admittedly. So what
Oh,
does that entail?
that entails somebody taking you in a helicopter to the top of some random mountain and skiing down it, and they
Oh,
do that in Kazakhstan. And
oh,
I would like to do that before I get too old.
okay. Right on. I think that's a first to come up on the podcast. Yeah, I don't think anyone's
Really?
brought up heli skiing before. So hence why I didn't know it, and hence why I'm intrigued. So. All right. And the last of these three questions, and this is a two-parter. What is your favorite animal, and have you seen this animal in the wild?
My favorite animal. I have a weird answer to that. Probably it's a gecko. Um, they run around on the walls in Spain, and I love sitting out having a beer and watching them. They can change colors, and the coolest thing is they use nuclear forces to stick to the walls. And most of the
Really?
people don't. Yes, Van der Waals forces. They have such tiny hairs on their feet. It interacts with the atoms in the walls, which I think is just extraordinarily cool.
That is
Nothing
pretty
not to
cool.
like about a gecko. Oh, and
Well,
they eat bugs.
yeah, now that you mention that, I do feel like, yeah, I've seen geckos quite a bit, especially when I'm in countries that border the Mediterranean. Like when I was in Israel and Morocco, I do recall, yeah, seeing geckos scurrying around in the cities there. And also, same thing with cats. I just also noticed that cats tend to roam around Mediterranean countries quite a bit too. And I'm assuming you've observed them quite a bit in Spain as well.
We don't have the weird cat thing in Spain, but I was
Hmm.
just spent a month in Greece, and there are cats everywhere. Like on some of the islands in Greece, it was kind of creepy.
Yeah, I wonder why that is, but I mean, yeah,
No
like
idea.
it's just I'll be like eating at an outdoor cafe and here comes like some cat like rubbing up against my leg wanting table scraps or whatever. So I'm like, well, this
Yeah.
is a first. I'm not used to just sitting outside somewhere and just having cats come up to me, but yeah.
Maybe they figure it's better than the rats. So
Yeah, actually, yeah, I haven't thought about that. So it very well could be because like when I was in Israel, I was there visiting a friend and she showed me like some of these cats like had like half their ear was clipped. And so I guess that was showing that they've actually been like picked up, inspected and vaccinated and all that stuff
oh, really?
and then like released. So it's like they're like domestic strays, I guess, for lack of better terms. So thought that
Yeah,
was
I think the
interesting.
same thing in Greece. They had charities that made sure all the cats were taken care of. So
Interesting. So, all
they
right, yeah, but
they,
I mean,
they seemed happy.
yeah, but Mediterranean countries and cats, so and geckos now, as we've also mentioned as well. So, all right, and so lastly, Mr. Mills, before we call it a day here, let's recap where our listeners can go and connect with you, where they can learn more about your work. So, websites, social media accounts. What do you got for us?
Yeah, kylemills.com, kind of go in depth on everything I've ever done. If you want to do social media, it's Kyle Mills Author, and that's Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram.
Okay,
And
and
all those places. If you want to email me, you can do that through my website. So I'm always out there.
all right, and like I said, I'll get all those linked up in the show notes for this episode, so listeners can go and find them there. All right, well, Kyle, before I let you go, I actually wanted to ask a favor of you, if I may, and I didn't prepare you for this, so so feel free to go with it, however you would like. But my father is a big fan as well, and he was actually the one that got me into the Mitch Rapp series initially, and when I told him that I was bringing you on the show, he actually got really excited for me. Like, I've been doing this podcast for a number of years now, and anytime I would tell him about any other guest, he'd be like, "Oh yeah, okay, that's cool, son. Yeah, that's cool." But then when I told him that I was bringing you on, his ears really perked up for that one. So my father's name is Victor, and I was hoping if I could ask you to maybe just give him a quick shout out on the podcast as we're rolling into it. I think it'd make for a great Christmas present.
Absolutely. Can I do it now?
Yes, please. Yes, sir.
All right. Hey, Victor, thanks for reading the books, and maybe we'll run into each other one day.
All right. Well, Kyle, I want to thank you very much for that. And of course, for joining me on the show today. It's just been really great to have you on and just to, hear your stories and actually meet the man behind one of my favorite book series. So yes, thank you again for taking the time for being here and sharing your insights with myself and the listeners. This has been fantastic.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
All right. Right on.